November 8, 1942, pre-dawn darkness off the coast of Fadala, Morocco. Major General George S. Patton stood on the bridge of USS Augusta, watching the Atlantic swells roll beneath a sky that promised dawn in 90 minutes. The Western Task Force had crossed 3,000 miles of ocean without detection, carrying 35,000 American soldiers toward beaches that intelligence suggested would offer minimal resistance. French colonial forces were nominally Vichy-aligned, but their loyalties remained uncertain. Radio intercepts indicated confusion in French command structure. Local populations showed signs of Allied sympathy. The landing should proceed unopposed. Patton checked his watch. H hour was set for 0400. Then coastal artillery opened fire from positions that were not supposed to be manned, tracers arcing over the invasion fleet with accuracy that suggested prepared defensive positions, and crews who had no intention of standing aside. The first salvos landed within 200 yards of transport ships, loaded with troops who had never seen combat. Patton watched the French fire intensify and understood immediately that intelligence had been catastrophically wrong about one fundamental assumption: the beaches would be contested. What had been planned as a political maneuver to bring French North Africa into the Allied camp had just become the first opposed amphibious invasion American forces would conduct in the European theater, and the first test of whether George Patton could deliver the aggressive warfare doctrine he'd spent 2 decades theorizing about in peacetime. Within 72 hours, Patton would secure Morocco through armored maneuver and aggressive tactics. That surprised not just the French, but Adolf Hitler himself, who had dismissed American combat capability and never anticipated the Allies could mount an invasion 3,000 miles from home. That would trap Axis forces between two fronts and begin the collapse of German control in North Africa. The debate had begun 6 months earlier, in Washington and London, across conference tables where strategic vision collided with military reality and political necessity. President Franklin Roosevelt sat opposite Prime Minister Winston Churchill at the White House in June 1942. Discussing how to strike Hitler when American forces possessed neither the training nor equipment for a cross-channel invasion that General George Marshall insisted was the only way to defeat Germany. Churchill argued that such an assault in 1943 would be premature, a slaughter on French beaches that would set the Allied cause back years. The British had already fought and bled against German forces in North Africa, where Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps threatened the Suez Canal and Britain's lifeline to India in the Middle East oil fields. Meanwhile, Stalin demanded immediate action, a second front to relieve pressure on Soviet forces. Grinding against Wehrmacht, divisions outside Stalingrad, Roosevelt needed American soldiers in combat against Germans before the end of 1942, for political reasons that transcended military logic. The compromise was Operation Torch, an invasion of French North Africa that satisfied no one completely, but offered strategic possibilities that might win the war. North Africa presented unique complications beyond German forces. French colonial territories in Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia were controlled by Vichy France, the collaborationist government that had signed armistice with Hitler in 1940. Vichy forces numbered over 120,000 troops across North Africa, with modern equipment, coastal artillery, and unclear loyalties. That intelligence could not reliably predict. Would they fight Americans landing on French soil? Would they join the Allies against Germany? Or would they remain neutral while German forces reinforced Tunisia and turned the Mediterranean into an Axis lake? Allied planners could not answer these questions with certainty, which meant Operation Torch would be gambling 107,000 troops on political assumptions that might prove catastrophically wrong within hours of the first landing. The Western Task Force departed Hampton Roads, Virginia, in late October 1942, carrying 35,000 soldiers under Patton's command, aboard over 100 ships that crossed the Atlantic without German detection. The operational security held, despite the massive scale of coordination required between American and British forces. 3 separate task forces landing simultaneously at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers, in diplomatic efforts to convince Vichy French commanders to stand aside. By November 7th, the invasion fleet was positioned off the North African coast, ready to commit American ground forces to combat in the European theater for the first time since 1918. This was America's test as a global military power, not simply whether its soldiers could fight, but whether the nation could project force across oceans, sustain armies thousands of miles from home, and coordinate complex operations with allies, whose strategic interests aligned imperfectly at best. The industrial might that had built the ships and produced the weapons now faced validation through the only metric that mattered in war. Could American forces defeat professional armies in conventional battle? The answer would come at dawn, on beaches where French guns waited, and German forces watched to see if the United States possessed the capability to threaten Hitler's empire beyond declarations and promises. But intelligence reports arriving hours before H-hour indicated Vichy French commanders had not agreed to Allied requests for cooperation, and coastal defense batteries remained manned, with crews prepared to resist invasion. Regardless of diplomatic entreaties, the first landing craft touched water at 0345 hours on November 8, 1942, 15 minutes before H-hour. Lowered from transport ships rolling in Atlantic swells that had worsened overnight, the Higgins boats were wooden-hulled vessels designed for civilian use and hastily converted to military service, because specialized amphibious craft had not yet been developed in sufficient numbers. Troops climbed down cargo nets in darkness, carrying full combat loads, rifles held overhead, while spray soaked their uniforms, and heavy seas threatened to crush boats against ship hulls, or capsize them before they reached the beach. No preliminary naval bombardment preceded the assault, because intelligence insisted French forces would not resist. Patton had overruled subordinates who argued for covering fire, gambling that political considerations would prevent bloodshed. Then French coastal batteries opened fire and proved intelligence catastrophically wrong. The amphibious assault doctrine in 1942 was primitive, compared to what would evolve by Normandy. No radio communication existed between landing craft and command ships. Wave control officers could not coordinate landing sequences when boats scattered in darkness and rough seas. Troops landed wherever currents and coxswain's navigation skills deposited them, often hundreds of yards from assigned beaches. Many boats broached in surf that peaked at 6 feet, dumping soldiers into water over their heads, weighted down by equipment that pulled them under. Others grounded on sandbars, forcing troops to wade ashore through chest-deep water, under fire from French positions that intelligence maps had not documented. The landing was chaos measured in minutes that felt like hours, with officers shouting orders that could not be heard over surf and gunfire, soldiers struggling to reach dry sand where they could form units, and advance inland according to plans. That had disintegrated the moment the first boat touched beach. USS Augusta and the covering force responded with naval gunfire. That silenced some French batteries, but could not suppress all defensive positions. Without risking American troops already ashore, French colonial infantry fought with skill and determination. That surprised American commanders who had expected token resistance. Street fighting developed in Fadala by mid-morning, as American forces pushed into the town, encountering prepared defensive positions at intersections and fortified buildings. Artillery duels continued through November 9th, as reinforcements landed and expanded the beachhead. Despite continuing difficulties with surf, that damaged landing craft and delayed delivery of heavy equipment and supplies. By November 10th, American forces had secured Fadala and surrounding areas, at cost of approximately 500 casualties, against over 3,000 French killed, wounded, and captured. The disparity reflected not American tactical superiority, but French defensive disadvantages. Once beachhead was established and naval gunfire could support advancing infantry, with accuracy that French artillery could not match, the victory validated amphibious assault doctrine in principle, while exposing critical flaws in execution. That would require 2 more years to resolve, through specialized landing craft, improved communications, and experience purchased through operations that Torch made possible. Patton stood on the beach November 10th, watching supplies pile up in disorder that logistics officers struggled to organize, while damaged landing craft littered the surf zone, as testimony to how close the operation had come to failure. The intelligence assumptions had been wrong. The coordination had failed. The equipment was inadequate. But American soldiers had fought their way ashore and won their first opposed amphibious invasion. Despite obstacles that should have prevented success, the question now was whether they could capitalize on tactical victory by achieving strategic objectives that had motivated the entire operation. Orders arrived from Eisenhower, directing Patton to advance on Casablanca, the main prize 15 miles south, where French naval forces remained concentrated, and German observers watched, to assess whether American forces represented legitimate threat or simply targets for Wehrmacht divisions. That would arrive once Hitler decided North Africa mattered enough to defend. Patton's armored columns advanced from Fadala toward Casablanca on November 10, 1942, with M3 Stuart light tanks and M4 Shermans. That had been laboriously unloaded at Safi, moving north to encircle the city from the south. The advance moved faster than French defenders could reposition, bypassing strong points and pushing toward the port. That represented Morocco's principal connection to Atlantic commerce and naval power. Casablanca was not simply a tactical objective, but a strategic prize whose capture would secure Morocco for the Allies, provide a major port for logistics operations, and demonstrate American capability to conduct mobile warfare against prepared defenses. French colonial forces fought delaying actions at road intersections and fortified positions, but could not stop the momentum of converging American columns that had weight of numbers and air superiority that French aviation could not contest after November 9th. Casablanca's importance extended beyond its immediate military value. The city served as headquarters for French naval forces in the Atlantic, home port to modern warships, including the battleship Jean Bart, which sat incomplete in harbor, with functioning main battery that could engage American vessels at ranges exceeding 30,000 yards. The port facilities handled commercial shipping. That sustained French Morocco's economy and military logistics. Losing Casablanca meant losing control of Morocco, which meant losing credibility with the colonial populations, whose loyalty to Vichy France depended on demonstrations that French forces could defend French territory against foreign invasion. Admiral François Michelier commanded French naval forces with orders to resist Allied landings. But by November 11th, his tactical situation had become untenable. American forces surrounded the city on land. Naval gunfire from USS Massachusetts and other heavy units could bombard French positions with impunity, and Jean Bart, despite heroic action by her crew, had taken repeated hits that disabled her fire control and left her unable to sortie. The naval battle of Casablanca had erupted November 8th, when French warships sortied from harbor under cover of smokescreens to engage American transports still unloading troops at Fadala. The sortie threatened to disrupt landing operations and inflict casualties that might turn tactical success into operational failure. American covering force intercepted the French squadron and engaged in surface action that destroyed or damaged most French vessels through superior gunnery and overwhelming firepower. The destroyer Boulonnais was sunk. The light cruiser Primo Gay was crippled. Smaller vessels were driven back to harbor or beach to prevent sinking. By November 11th, French naval capability had been reduced to coastal batteries and Jean Bart's immobilized guns, neither of which could prevent American ground forces from entering Casablanca if Patton ordered assault. Michelier requested armistice November 11th at U-700 hours, after consultation with General Auguste Nogues, who commanded all Vichy forces in Morocco. The ceasefire took effect at 0715, sparing Casablanca from street fighting. That would have destroyed significant portions of the city and caused civilian casualties that political considerations could not justify. Patton entered Casablanca that afternoon to accept formal surrender and establish American authority over Morocco's principal city. The campaign had lasted 3 days, from first landing to final surrender. American casualties totaled approximately 500 killed and wounded. French casualties exceeded 3,000, plus warships lost that could not be replaced. The victory validated Patton's aggressive doctrine, while simultaneously exposing problems that more experienced armies would have exploited. Coordination between infantry and armor remained imperfect. Communications failures created confusion that competent enemy could have turned into defeat. Logistics broke down repeatedly. Air support was haphazard. But American soldiers had proven they could fight, and Patton had proven he could command large formations in mobile operations that achieved strategic objectives. through speed and aggression rather than methodical preparation. The question was whether these lessons would translate to combat against German forces, who possessed training, equipment, and experience that French colonial troops lacked. News arrived that Center Task Force at Oran and Eastern Task Force at Algiers had also encountered fierce French resistance. That intelligence had not predicted, confirming that Operation Torch's political assumptions had been fundamentally flawed. Even as the military execution achieved its objectives, the resistance that American forces encountered across Morocco, Algeria, and Oran revealed a fundamental miscalculation about French colonial loyalties. That intelligence had failed to predict. French officers and soldiers who fought against American landings were not collaborating with Germany in any meaningful sense. They were defending French territory against foreign invasion, under orders from a government they considered legitimate, regardless of its accommodation with Hitler. The complexity of this position traced back to June 1940, when France signed armistice with Germany. That created Vichy France under Marshal Philippe Patton. The armistice terms allowed Germany to occupy northern France and the Atlantic coast, while leaving southern France and the colonial empire under French administration. Patton's government at Vichy collaborated with Germany on political matters, including anti-Semitic legislation and deportation of Jews, but maintained nominal independence and control over military forces that included over 120,000 colonial troops in North Africa. These forces swore oaths to Vichy, not to Hitler, and viewed their duty as defending French territory, regardless of who attacked it. American diplomatic efforts before Operation Torch had assumed that French colonial commanders would welcome liberation from Vichy control and join the Allied cause with minimal fighting. Robert Murphy, Roosevelt's diplomatic representative in North Africa, had cultivated relationships with French officers, believed sympathetic to the Allies. Intelligence reports suggested that token resistance might occur for honor's sake, but would cease once American superiority became evident. These assumptions proved catastrophically wrong because they misunderstood the psychological and political reality of French colonial forces. From their perspective, Americans were invaders, threatening French sovereignty over territories that France had controlled for decades. Vichy's collaboration with Germany was political necessity imposed by defeat, not ideological alignment. Defending North Africa against American invasion was defending France, regardless of whether Hitler benefited strategically from prolonged French resistance. Admiral Jean-François Darlan's presence in Algiers on November 8th provided unexpected opportunity to resolve the political crisis. Darlan commanded all Vichy French forces and possessed authority that no other French officer in North Africa could claim. After 3 days of fighting demonstrated that continued resistance would result in complete military defeat, Darlan negotiated ceasefire agreement on November 10th that ordered all French forces in North Africa to stop fighting and cooperate with Allied forces. His order ended most active resistance and brought approximately 60,000 French colonial troops to the Allied side, along with naval vessels, air bases, and port facilities. That Operation Torch needed to succeed strategically. The Darlan deal created immediate controversy. That exposed moral contradictions at the heart of Allied policy. Eisenhower agreed to retain Darlan as High Commissioner of French North Africa and keep Vichy administrative officials in positions of power in exchange for their cooperation. This decision prioritized military expedience over political principle by legitimizing collaborators, whom the Free French under Charles de Gaulle considered traitors. Roosevelt defended the arrangement as temporary military necessity. Churchill supported it reluctantly. De Gaulle condemned it as betrayal of Free French forces, who had been fighting Germany since 1940, while Vichy collaborated. The controversy revealed that Operation Torch was not liberation in any pure sense, but negotiated transfer of control that preserved elements of the system it ostensibly opposed. Darlan's assassination on December 24, 1942, by Bonnier de la Chapelle, a young French monarchist, connected to resistance networks, eliminated the controversial figure, but not the political problems his deal had created. General Henri Giraud replaced Darlan as French commander in North Africa, but the fundamental question remained unresolved. What did Allied victory mean when it required accommodation with the forces that had collaborated with Hitler and maintained repressive colonial systems, that contradicted stated Allied principles? The answer would shape not just North African campaign, but post-war settlements. That determined who controlled France and its empire when Germany finally surrendered. Allied forces began their drive east toward Tunisia on November 16, 1942, hoping to capture Tunis and Bizerta before German forces could establish defensive positions protecting these vital ports. The British First Army under Lieutenant General Kenneth Anderson advanced from Algiers with orders to cover the 500 miles to Tunis as quickly as logistics allowed. American and British columns raced through Algeria, encountering minimal resistance from French colonial forces who had ceased fighting after Darlan's ceasefire order. By November 17th, lead elements reached Jebel Abiod, less than 50 miles from Tunis. The prize appeared within grasp. Tunisia controlled the central Mediterranean, a geographic choke point that separated Axis supply routes to Libya from Italian bases in Sicily. Capturing Bizerte and Tunis would trap Rommel's Africa Corps, retreating westward from Egypt. After Montgomery's Eighth Army victory at El Alamein in early November, the strategic logic was compelling. Two Allied armies converging from opposite directions could crush Axis forces in North Africa and secure the entire southern Mediterranean coast for subsequent operations against Sicily and Italy. German response shattered these optimistic calculations. Hitler recognized Tunisia's strategic importance immediately and ordered emergency reinforcement, despite Axis losses elsewhere that made every division precious. The Luftwaffe began airlift operations from Sicily on November 9th, transporting paratroopers and advance units of the 334th Infantry Division. Transport ships escorted by Italian destroyers ran supplies and heavy equipment across the 100-mile gap separating Bizerte from Sicily at night to avoid Allied air interdiction. By November 17th, German forces under Colonel General Walther Nering had established defensive positions protecting Tunis, with approximately 15,000 troops, a number that would grow to over 100,000 by year's end. The narrow Tunisian bridgehead became an Axis stronghold that Allied forces could not reduce through the opportunistic exploitation that had characterized Operation Torch's initial success. Allied logistics collapsed under the strain of supporting operations 500 miles from Algiers, over single-track railways and dirt roads. That winter, rains transformed into impassable mud, supplies piled up at ports, while frontline units ran short of ammunition, fuel, and food. The Luftwaffe achieved temporary air superiority over Tunisia, flying from airfields near Tunis, while Allied aircraft operated from bases in Algeria, beyond effective range for sustained operations. German defensive tactics exploited terrain advantages, positioning forces on commanding heights that Allied attacks could not dislodge, without casualties that Anderson's limited forces could not sustain. The first Allied offensive toward Tunis, November 25th through December 10th, gained minimal ground at heavy cost before stalling completely in torrential rains. That turned the battlefield into quagmire, where tracked vehicles bogged down and infantry could not maneuver. By late December, both sides had settled into winter stalemate, with front lines stabilized roughly 30 miles west of Tunis. Operation Torch had succeeded tactically by securing Morocco and Algeria, with fewer casualties than pessimistic estimates predicted. But the strategic objective, trapping and destroying Axis forces in North Africa, remained unachieved, because Allied planners had underestimated German capacity for rapid response and overestimated their own logistical capability to sustain offensive operations at distances that exceeded their supply infrastructure. The North African campaign that was supposed to conclude by Christmas 1942 would continue for another 6 months of grinding attrition warfare. American forces would learn costly lessons about German tactical proficiency in February 1943 at Kasserine Pass, where inexperienced Substitute Corps units suffered defeat. That exposed training deficiencies and leadership failures. The disaster prompted Eisenhower to relieve Major General Lloyd Fredendall and appoint George Patton to command 2 Corps in March 1943, with orders to restore American combat effectiveness and credibility through the aggressive warfare doctrine he had demonstrated capturing Casablanca. Patton arrived at the 2nd Corps headquarters on March 6, 1943, to find demoralized units still recovering from the Kasserine Pass disaster, where German forces under Rommel had inflicted over 6,000 American casualties and exposed fundamental failures in leadership, training, and doctrine. Eisenhower's orders were clear: restore two-corps combat effectiveness and credibility. Within 10 days for offensive operations, scheduled to support Montgomery's 8th Army attack on the Mareth Line, Patton surveyed the 88,000-man corps and immediately instituted sweeping changes. That reflected his belief that discipline, aggression, and visible leadership would transform defeated soldiers into effective combat forces. He ordered all personnel to wear complete uniforms, with helmets, leggings, and ties. Even in forward areas, he established rigorous schedules. He fined soldiers $50 for not wearing helmets. He moved constantly throughout the command, talking with men, inspecting positions, and projecting confidence that two corps would succeed in its coming battles, because failure was simply unacceptable to a commander who expected excellence and would accept nothing less. Patton's leadership methods were controversial but effective. He demanded strict adherence to military protocol, not for bureaucratic reasons, but because external discipline reinforced internal resolve. Soldiers who looked like professional troops began acting like professional troops. He emphasized aggressive patrolling to seize initiative from Axis forces who had dominated the battlefield since Kasserine. He coordinated armor-infantry artillery tactics through rehearsals and clear orders. That eliminated the confusion which had plagued the Second Corps under Fredendall. Most importantly, he led from forward positions, where troops could see their commanding general. Sharing the risks he ordered them to take, his reported order for an attack near Gafsa. Ending, I expect to see such casualties among officers, particularly staff officers, as will convince me that a serious effort has been made to capture this objective, demonstrated his uncompromising expectations. Officers would lead from the front or be relieved. There would be no more command posts 50 miles behind the lines, while soldiers fought without clear direction. The Battle of El Guitar, March 23 through April 7, validated Patton's transformation of the two corps. After 1st Infantry Division captured Gafsa on March 17, and Rangers seized El Guitar on March 18. German commanders recognized the threat to their southern flank and ordered 10th Panzer Division to counterattack. The battle that developed tested whether American forces could defeat Wehrmacht armored formations in conventional engagement. On March 23, German panzers advanced toward Algetar, supported by artillery and Stuka dive bombers. American forces held prepared positions, with improved anti-tank capabilities, including British 6-pounder guns, replacing ineffective 37mm weapons. The infantry fought with discipline Fredendall's corps had lacked. Artillery fire was coordinated effectively. Tank destroyers engaged German armor at ranges where American guns could penetrate panzer armor. The German attack stalled with heavy losses and withdrew after failing to break American lines. Sedun Corps then advanced 30 miles, threatening Axis communications, while Montgomery's 8th Army broke through the Mareth Line, forcing German withdrawal toward Tunis. El Guitar was the first major American victory against Wehrmacht forces in World War II. It proved that properly trained, led, and equipped American units could defeat German armored divisions through coordinated combined arms tactics. Patton's aggressive warfare doctrine had worked, not through reckless assault, but through disciplined execution of sound tactical principles. The victory restored American credibility with British allies, who had questioned U.S. combat effectiveness after Kasserine. It validated Patton's leadership methods, while revealing his exceptional talent for armored warfare. That would define his subsequent campaigns in Sicily, France, and Germany. By May 13, 1943, Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered, with 275,000 prisoners, ending the North African campaign. That had begun 6 months earlier with Operation Torch's landings. The Mediterranean was now an Allied lake. Sicily would be invaded in July, and George Patton had proven on battlefields from Casablanca to El Guitar that he was precisely the aggressive, uncompromising commander that mobile warfare required. By May 1943, North Africa was secured, But the cross-channel invasion of France remained 18 months away, delayed until June 1944 by the very campaign that was supposed to hasten Germany's defeat. Stalin's demands for a second front to relieve pressure on Soviet forces remained unfulfilled, except through the indirect benefit of tying down Axis divisions in the Mediterranean that might otherwise have reinforced the Eastern Front. The strategic debate that had divided Roosevelt and Churchill, from Marshall's planning staff, appeared vindicated in Churchill's favor. The peripheral approach had worked, but at what cost to the ultimate objective of defeating Germany through direct assault on its industrial heartland? Operation Torch achieved objectives that transcended immediate battlefield results. Over 700,000 Allied troops gained combat experience in North Africa. That would prove essential for subsequent operations in Sicily, Italy, and France. The logistical systems required to transport, supply, and sustain armies across oceans were tested and refined through practical application. That revealed deficiencies no peacetime exercise could have exposed. Strategic cooperation between American and British forces was forged through shared planning, coordination failures, and hard-won victories. That established procedures and relationships that would function more smoothly in later campaigns. Most critically, Axis forces were compelled to defend multiple fronts simultaneously. German divisions sent to Tunisia could not reinforce Stalingrad or defend Sicily. Italian military capability collapsed under pressure it could not sustain. The Mediterranean sea lanes that had been contested since 1940 became Allied-controlled waterways. That enabled operations Churchill had advocated since before America entered the war. Sicily fell to Allied invasion in July 1943 through amphibious assaults that benefited directly from lessons learned during Operation Torch. The Italian campaign followed in September, when Allied forces crossed from Sicily to the mainland, precipitating Italy's surrender on September 8th and Germany's occupation of its former ally. Mussolini's government collapsed. Italian armed forces ceased effective resistance. German forces were forced to defend the entire Italian peninsula against Allied advances that tied down divisions Hitler desperately needed elsewhere. Each of these operations flowed causally from Operation Torch's success in securing North Africa as the launching point for Mediterranean strategy. That knocked Italy out of the war and forced Germany into defensive posture across multiple theaters simultaneously. November 8, 1942 represented America's transformation from industrial power to global military force, capable of projecting combat capability across oceans and sustaining it against professional armies in conventional warfare. The surprise that Patton delivered to Hitler was not tactical deception or operational cleverness, but strategic capacity. The United States had transported 107,000 troops across 3,000 miles of ocean without German detection, landed them on contested beaches, defeated French resistance, and then sustained offensive operations against Wehrmacht forces until Axis surrender. This capability, the ability to build, transport, supply, and command armies anywhere on Earth, was the ultimate weapon that industrial democracy wielded against industrial totalitarianism. It would be demonstrated again at Normandy, where 6 divisions became 39 in 90 days. It would sustain Patton's Third Army across France, on logistics chains that stretched hundreds of miles, and it would enable Allied victory through material superiority that Germany could never match. Despite tactical excellence that often won battles, but could not win the war, the legacy of Operation Torch was not simply that it secured North Africa, or opened the Mediterranean, or knocked Italy out of the war. Its legacy was proving that American military power could be projected globally, with decisive effect against any opponent, regardless of their professional skill or tactical doctrine. Hitler had dismissed American combat capability as inferior. Patton proved him catastrophically wrong on beaches at Fadala, in streets of Casablanca, and on battlefields at El Ghoutar, where American soldiers demonstrated they could fight and win against Wehrmacht divisions that had conquered most of Europe. That demonstration began November 8, 1942, when George Patton stood on the bridge of USS Augusta, watching French artillery fire, and understood that American credibility would be established, not through declarations, but through victory